And for those that have joined, if you want to check in on your audio, if you'd like to do that, if you're ready to share your one word of where you're at in this very moment, you can also put that in the chat.
Mic check. Feeling pretty good.
Great. Thanks, James.
Angela, I'm alert and ready.
Great. Thanks, Angela.
And Dave Sharon, I'm ready.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Quick reminder, your first name and location if you have a chance to rename yourself.
Kathy Auburn, I'm ready. Ready, willing, and able.
Excellent.
Except for my photo.
Okay. No problem.
Claudia Ellensberg, ready to learn from more people.
Great. Thanks, Claudia.
John from Vancouver. Feel like a sponge. I'm ready to absorb.
Great. Thanks, John.
Kat from Lake Stevens, ready to learn stuff.
Great. Thanks, Kat.
Hi, Pia. Thanks. Well, I will.
Hi.
Hi there.
Yeah. Hello, how's everybody doing? Good, doing good.
Hey, Mel.
All right.
Better if I could get my video working.
Milton from Seattle. Yeah.
Hi there, Milton.
Hello.
Camino Island. Can't figure out how to do this island thing.
Judy from Vancouver.
Hi there, Judy.
This is Lori from Woodby.
Hi, Lori.
Hi, Robert from Bellingham.
Hi, Robert. And quick reminder, Brent or Wendy, want to give a quick reminder of how to rename folks? Maybe we can put that in the chat.
Yes, I'll put in the chat, but basically if you hover over your little window with your face on it, there'll be 3 dots on the top right. You can click on that and then click rename and then type in what you want to rename yourself.
Great. And it is officially 6 o'clock. So in the interest of starting on time and ending on time, I would like to welcome all of you to Tuesday night's session for the Washington Climate Assembly. This is session number 6 of our learning sessions, which is hard to believe in some fronts, right? It's been going fast. And we are meeting today from 6 p.m. till 8 p.m. This is live stream, so folks can follow along that are not in the virtual room with us today. And for those folks that haven't had a chance yet to share one word in the chat, if you'd like to share, we've got a few in here already. Somebody's bruised, sorry to hear that. Hi, ready to learn, good evening, ready. Folks are trickling in here, good evening. There's one word that describes kind of how you're feeling in this current moment. Feel free to share that in the chat. Hopeful, let's do this. Fantastic. Ready, awake, awake is good. And throughout the course of the night, quick reminder, if you do need to stand up, grab coffee, tea, water, at any moment, feel free to, of course, do that. And with that, I will start with a land acknowledgement. We will be putting Brent's information in the chat as well. If any tech issues do come up, please give him a call, send him a text, and he will help you to figure that out. So land acknowledgement, we wish to acknowledge that the people of Washington State live and work on traditional lands of the indigenous people who've been here since time immemorial. 29 federally recognized tribes and 7 non-federally recognized tribes within the boundaries of Washington State. Tribes and tribal people bring thousands of years of traditional knowledge to our present moment. Tribes bring an important and vital voice to our current conversation, and we honor tribal relations. Quick reminder to please keep yourself muted if you haven't had a chance yet to rename yourself. For presenters, full name, presenter. For assembly numbers, first name, comma, location. And for observers, first name, observer. And we've got Brent's information in the chat. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike for a walkthrough of tonight's agenda.
Great, thank you. So tonight we're going to have a series of wonderful presenters and followed by our typical Q&A session. And then we're again going to do the breakouts and then some next steps. And today we're going to preserve a little bit more time for these next steps as well, outlining how we're going into our final learning session this Saturday. So again, going through and reviewing what we've heard from the last session and just making sure we continue to remind ourselves. So we heard from Eileen Quigley about Washington's greenhouse gas emissions and how they relate to the rest of the Pacific Northwest and some of the key strategies such as energy efficiency, clean electricity, electrification, low carbon fuels, and carbon capture are pathways to decarbonization. We learned more about opportunities of climate policies in the energy sector. We heard from Nancy Hirsch on current energy utilities, sources of where our energy comes from, history of policies that have made the utility sector more sustainable, and opportunities for Washington State to continue that progress. We also heard from Andrea Axel about the Green Divide and examples of community projects and opportunities for the state to help them and to continue community energy planning. We heard from Pedro Valverde on about renewable energy from a local level and about some of the technologies that are useful to keep in mind to implement some of these low carbon tools. We learned from Kate Simonin about the building sector, thinking about emissions throughout the entire life cycle of a building, from the material creation to the end of a building's life, learning about opportunities for existing and new buildings, the electrical grid, and building materials that are being considered in the Washington State Legislature, such as the Buy Clean, Buy Fair Washington Act. We also learned about some of the opportunities within the transportation sector. We heard from Annabelle Drayton on what's currently in place and what it means for electrification of transportation and some of the opportunities in the state. We also learned from Representative Fitzgibbon and Ali Lee about the Clean Fuel Standard legislation as well. And so framing, again, this is, it's a lot of information. And so just keeping and continuing this framing between our sessions is tonight we're going to be talking about what are some of the political issues and considerations about climate mitigation. And specifically thinking about our learning objectives, tonight we're going to hear from multiple experts about this very topic. We're going to hear from multiple experts about the history of climate mitigation policies in Washington State, including carbon pricing efforts, current policies that are being implemented, and the fossil fuel and transport sector. We'll also learn about upcoming opportunities and legislation that the state is considering around climate change, emissions reduction, environmental justice, and other existing acts. And finally, we're going to hear from an expert about how Washington's policies and the legislation sits within the broader international political spectrum and realm that climate change is being acted on at that stage. This is a quick reminder again, tonight we only have experts presenting, but typically we have a mix of experts and interested parties, and just wanting to remind people of that difference. And again, reminding people of the coordinating team's role. So the coordinating team here is to coordinate the assembly. We're the process people so that you, the assembly members, can focus on the content. We'll be holding the container for deliberation, and we want to serve as neutral third-party facilitators. So if at any time you have an experience that's different than this, please share the feedback in the surveys following each of our sessions directly with us or with the monitoring team. We again want to remind people about here. And so today's topic area, political issues and considerations for climate mitigation. To As you hear from the presenters, keep thinking about this question: how can Washington State equitably design and implement mitigation strategies while strengthening communities disproportionately impacted by climate change across the state? And think about what recommendations might be considered, what might be effective, what resonate with you. And building off of that is thinking about, and some of these are the same questions we've prompted over the past several learning sessions, about what does climate change mean for the state? And what are the barriers to change? Thinking from your own perspective, what's important is your values and your views. And finally, what's important for Washington State? How does the information that you're hearing and you're learning impact your 50-year vision? And this is a reminder in our very, very inaugural session. We did a visioning exercise and thinking about what do we want 50 years from now? What do we want the state to look like? What do we want our world to look like? And just think about how that fits with your vision. So I'm going to turn this over to Gretchen.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. A couple of things that we wanted to hear. We know many of you had a chance, but not everybody had a chance to take the survey. We will be putting that survey link. Now that we've got the research team on board, we'll just be using their survey as the feedback form, and we'll be putting that at that link in the chat at the end of every meeting. And so if you have a moment to just take that, we get those responses back anonymously, but get those responses back. And a few things that we heard from Saturday's session: need to better communicate to presenters about time allotment so they aren't rushed at the end of their time. And so we've been working with our presenters for this session in a little bit more of an intentional way, and we'll be texting folks kind of a 5-minute reminder and a 1-minute reminder via text as well for the presenters to stay in their time allotment. The most common comment actually that we heard from this weekend session was around the use of chat. And as we'd mentioned earlier on, but didn't put in the chat of this prompt, just to remind folks to please just use chat to post questions and then to upvote questions that you see from the other assembly members. And to refrain from sharing your opinions, to refrain from sharing reactions to somebody else's opinion in the chat, and truly just using it to post questions and then to upvote. So we'll be reminding folks, we're reminding folks now of that, and then we'll also be reminding folks in the chat as well. Those were the 2 big comments. Again, just a reminder to please take a moment. The survey for tonight is a bit shorter than it was on Saturday, but we do have the research team on board, so we'll be using that moving forward. And thanks to those who provided really valuable input. A couple of other ways that we've been sharing the independent research. We've been uploading the independent research that folks have put into the form up on the website as well in the resources document that Wendy shared. And submitting recommendations are also uploading those and putting them on the shared folder as well. And with that, we'll go ahead and move directly into our first set of presentations for the night. Lauren Breinart is presenting first, and she'll be presenting on the history of climate policies in Washington State and opportunities in the 2021 legislative session as an expert presenter. She is currently the Coalition Director of the Climate Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy, which is a statewide climate justice coalition based in Washington State with a focus on building a resilient climate justice movement and passing equitable solutions to the climate crisis. The learning objective here is to learn about the history of climate policies, including carbon pricing and other related policies in Washington State, and about upcoming priorities in the current 2021 legislative session and beyond. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Lauren.
Awesome. Thanks for that introduction. Sorry, my my image isn't super in good focus. We need more rural broadband. I live in Port Angeles, Washington, and as the coordination team said, I'm Lauren Breinart, and I'm the Coalition Director for the Climate Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy, and I'm really excited to be here today. And I'm also grateful for each and every one of you for taking the time to listen, to share your knowledge, and to help provide equitable solutions to the climate crisis. So today I was tasked to talk about the history of climate policy in our state. And really I focused our presentation on the past couple of years to really go more in depth. So yeah, I will try not to bore you. So as you see in this first slide, our coalition is vast. The Climate Alliance was founded in 2014 with the intention of bringing together a diverse set of partners to pass equitable solutions to the climate crisis at the statewide level. Our partners include labor unions, community of color-based organizations, environmental organizations, health professionals, faith communities, and we work alongside tribal nations across the state. Next slide. Our coalition was founded on the belief that the climate crisis requires profound systems transformation for energy sources, political and racial power structures in our economic system, and that in order to achieve transformative solutions to the climate crisis, we need everyone at the table. And we fundamentally believe in the following kind of core principles that any climate policy must have. And that is number one, that communities hardest hit by pollution and climate change must have equitable representation at the decision-making table. They must receive an equitable share of investments and benefits and see a tangible reduction in pollution in their communities. That there must be a just transition for workers and impact communities in the transition to a clean energy economy, particularly our fossil fuel workers and communities and low-income and communities of color across the state. We also believe that climate policy must recognize tribal sovereignty and abide by the law of free, prior, and informed consent. And lastly, all climate policy must reduce climate pollution by holding those most responsible for causing the pollution accountable, and also to not disproportionately or unnecessarily increase costs for people with lower incomes, and also to provide financial assistance to low-income households. So those are our key principles that we view climate policy. And over the past couple of years, we have worked in the state legislature and also on the ballot to try to pass those policies. So I'll go over some of the key policies that we have helped shape, that I have experience in working on that, yeah. So back in 2018, thank you, our coalition developed and ran a ballot initiative called Initiative 1631. Maybe most of you voted on it. So it would have advanced a fee on carbon pollution and raised about $1 billion per year to invest in carbon reduction projects and programs. So this was one of the first kind of big climate policies that came on the ballot in Washington state, and really was one of the first across the nation. So this initiative was seen as a pretty bold and equitable example of what climate policy can look like. And so I'll just kind of explain some of the components in it. One, this initiative would have reinvested 35% of the carbon fee into communities most disproportionately impacted by pollution and the climate crisis. So lower income communities across the state, rural communities across the state, communities of color. In addition, this measure would have generated significant investment in the clean energy transition and also provided worker protections, just transition protections for workers, for example, like in the fossil fuel industry, would have made sure that workers that may have lost their job, they would get early retirement, they would get reworker training, they would get their a certain percentage of their wages after their job. So we really want to make sure, we truly believe that any climate policy needs to have just transition elements such as this. And lastly, the initiative also recognized tribal sovereignty, provided consultation and free, prior, informed consent, and then mandated tribal participation on the oversight board and in the investment decision-making process. So as many of you know, the oil industry spent $31 million and we did not get that initiative passed on the ballot. However, that policy and all that work, organizing work, really developed a strong narrative around climate justice, and I think created a blueprint for what we see as equitable climate policy for future legislative sessions. So I'll go into next slide, and I'll go into 2019 and 2020 legislative policies and go into a bit more detail. These are examples that we believe are examples of good, equitable climate policies that have already been passed by our state legislature. So, so for example, one major climate win in the 2019 legislative session was the state legislature passed a 100% Clean Electricity Act. So this policy is actually seen as one of the most rigorous clean electricity laws in the nation. It is going to transition Washington's electricity grid to 100% clean energy by 2045. The law phases out coal from Washington's grid by 2025, the TransAlta coal plant, and requires 80% clean electricity by 2030, and reduces our state's overall emissions by 20%, curbing out also new fracked gas infrastructure. This law was actually, pretty transformative and rigorous in one way because it required incentives for union labor and union contractors for clean energy providers. I'm sure our labor partners could talk more about that. And this law in particular, it kind of had the three pillars of strong worker protection. It addressed systematic and economic inequality and reduced climate pollution. Those are the three pillars we want to see in any climate policy. So the next in 2019, or you can go back to the next slide, is, or the previous one, was the legislature passed strong clean buildings law. And so this law reduces 20% of Washington's built environment greenhouse gas emissions created by the built environment by 2035. And it does this by overhauling our state's building code standards, by setting really strong requirements for new commercial buildings to meet strong energy efficiency standards and electric vehicle readiness requirements. Also required natural gas utilities to become more energy efficient. So in 2019, we were able to pass a strong 100% clean electricity and also mandate reductions in our buildings. David will talk about the Environmental Justice Task Force that was created also in 2019 session, but I won't mention too much about that. In the 2020 legislative session, the legislature passed strong climate pollution limits. And so that bill creates not a requirement, but a goal for our state to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 95% below 1990 levels by 2050. What that really means is that this law requires incentivizes our state to put Washington on a path to achieve net zero emissions by mid-century. So this was a really important kind of goalpost for our state legislature. And now we as a coalition with these strong limits, we are calling and we need to call on our legislature to meet these limits because these limits are not enforceable. So we need to make sure that we are now passing policies to ensure that we meet these. All right, next slide. So that takes us to the present moment that we are in. I think you guys all are very well aware, probably living this out right now. Washingtonians are grappling with multiple simultaneous crises. We have a public health emergency. We have an economic crisis. We were already dealing with an ongoing climate crisis, staggering wealth inequalities and health disparities across our state. I think we also know as a coalition, most of you, that the impacts of both the climate crisis and COVID-19 are disproportionately impacting working people on the front lines, lower income and communities of color. For example, farm workers who have worked throughout this pandemic on the front lines are often underpaid, low income, disproportionately are immigrant, people of color. And farm workers are also on the front lines of the climate crisis, working throughout the summer with increased heat and extreme weather events. So from that perspective, I firmly believe, and our coalition does too, that we can no longer think of the climate crisis as only an environmental issue. The climate crisis is economic, an immigration, a health, and an environmental crisis all in one. Therefore, through using this lens, we cannot solve the climate crisis without simultaneously increasing wages. We cannot solve the climate crisis without making housing more affordable, reducing health disparities, and reducing income inequality. In order to get out of all of these crises, we believe that we must act boldly and intersectionally. And just add on to that, many of the solutions needed to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 and to get us out of this recession and into recovery will also transition us to climate justice, such as increasing access to affordable healthcare, increasing the minimum wage, increasing access to affordable housing, investments in the renewable energy economy that can create thousands, if not millions, of jobs. So we have a really pivotal opportunity in front of us. So this legislative session, our coalition is calling on state legislators to support our Resilient Future platform. And from this screen, these are our kind of key principles of what make up a resilient future. And we are calling on state leaders to enact bold relief and climate resilient policies that invest in the long-term resilience of at-risk workers and low-income communities and communities of color and tribal nations across our state. I'll go into a couple of our top priorities this session. And then that will be it. So our top priorities this session are to pass the Healthy Environment for All Act, which David and Samir will talk about. This is super necessary, essential work. As well as we need to pass amendments to the Growth Management Act, which I will talk about, but FutureWise is going to add on, and that we need to invest in a clean and just transportation system as well as pass revenue. I'm going to skip about the HEAL Act because I know Samir was front and centered and David are going to talk more about that, but I just want to note that the Healthy Environment for All Act this legislative session is a key bedrock foundational policy that we need passed. This will ensure it will set a strong foundation for environmental justice and future climate policies. So as we take the slide, and I think as you heard from other presenters or the previous slide, transportation still remains the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Washington state. This legislature, or this session, the legislature is working on possibly, hopefully, passing a transportation package. And so our coalition is calling on the legislature to pass new and equitable transportation revenue sources and investments that reduce climate pollution, advance safety, accessibility, and reduce air pollution, et cetera. So we're calling for revenue sources such as an air quality surcharge, a carbon fee, et cetera. So new, more progressive transportation revenue sources that get us outside of the box of a gas tax. And as well, we need equitable investments. We need more funding into transit, into rural transit, into broadband access, stormwater, into culverts, into maintenance and preservation of our highways and bridges. We would like to see more maintenance and preservations of our highways and bridges over highway expansion. We want to see transportation electrification infrastructure. Those are key investments that can get us into the just transition that we need. Slide. FutureWise will talk a bit more about this tonight, but we also need to update the Washington Growth Management Act in 3 ways: by creating more affordable housing, by planning for climate change resiliency, and to require environmental justice in our planning. This is key bedrock climate policy work. And the next slide is, or the next priority and next slide is, our coalition is calling for the legislature to pass full progressive funding that drives down pollution and supports climate resilient investments. That could look like an equitable carbon pricing policy. That could look like a capital gains tax, an inheritance tax. There are many options on the table. And lastly, we are supporting a host of relief bills that support relief and recovery of impacted communities, such as Immigrant Worker Relief Fund, Utility Shutoff Bill, which will make sure that if folks haven't been able to pay their utility bills, they will not get shut off, or if they can't pay their bills. So that is sort of a host of the policies that are on the table. We see the need to view climate policy as a win-win for environment and jobs and communities most impacted. We envision a climate resilient future that has those key pillars. So I want to close with sharing a couple quotes of our amazing coalition partners just to bring them in the room with me. So if you can go to the next slide, that's our website to read more about the work. And the next slide. Awesome. So this is Edgar Franks. He is a political director of Familias Unidas por la Justicia, an independent farm worker union who is also doing organizing work in Yakima. And he says, for us farm workers, a just response would be to ensure that the historic injustices that have existed and brought us to this point don't keep occurring. And next up is, I believe, Jill Mangaliman. Next slide. With Got Green, based in Seattle, that as much as COVID-19 is a public health crisis, it is an environmental injustice. A just recovery we need is a just transition of our economy. The next slide, I believe, is Alyssa Macy, CEO of Washington Environmental Council, a statewide environmental organization. And she says, the status quo is not good enough. The worst thing that can come out of this crisis is nothing changes. And last is Derek Gruen, who is a co-executive director of Front and Centered. And he says, to achieve a just transition, we must follow the leadership, knowledge, and expertise of communities disproportionately most affected. So yeah, I hope that gave a brief overview of the climate history. There's a lot more to it. But yeah, thanks for the time.
Okay, and we'll move directly into our next presenter here, Eric D. Place. Presenting on the fossil fuel transport as an expert presenter. He's the director of Thin Green Line program at the Sightline Institute, devoted to shedding light on coal, oil, and gas development in the Northwest. And the learning objective here is to learn about the history of fossil fuel transportation policies, why they're needed, and how they link to other carbon emissions reduction policies and strategies.
Okay, thanks, folks. I'm going to jump right in and hope we can get started here. My name is Eric DePlace, as Gretchen said. Now let's see if I can get this on slideshow view. There we go. I've been researching energy and climate policy for about 20 years, both with Sightline Institute, which is a Pacific Northwest think tank with a focus on energy and climate issues, and also with the Ohio River Valley Institute, which is an Appalachia-based think tank that works especially in Pennsylvania and West Virginia on fossil fuel and economic issues. I'm going to launch right into this, and I'll try to keep it clipped enough to stay on schedule, but informative enough to give us some information. This is a look at Washington's greenhouse gas portfolio in the most simplistic way. So we have about 100 million metric tons of carbon emitted each year in this state. Of that carbon, 85% of it is fossil fuels, and 15% is everything else. So from the perspective of reducing carbon emissions, the vast majority of where we want to focus is on fossil fuels. Now, fossil fuels are used for a whole range of things, which we'll talk about in a moment, but it's important to sort of start from the perspective that fossil fuels, for those of you who aren't maybe familiar with that particular term, well, you probably heard it from Eileen and others, they are energy-rich substances. There are 3 of them, and I'll talk about them in a second, and they power the vast majority of our modern economy. Everyone on this call uses fossil fuels every day, and we have been for a long time. Now, that's changing a little bit because the second point that goes along with that is that fossil fuels are not magic. They do provide very important energy services that make the economy we have today run, make our modern lives possible. But nearly all of the uses for which we use fossil fuels can be replaced with other forms of energy. And that's actually happening right now. It's been happening at speed for the last 10 years. It's happening rather quickly right now. And the last point, which is sort of expressed humorously, is fossil fuels are not ninjas. They do not sort of magically appear in our homes or in our cars or anywhere else that they're used. They're heavy, or they're otherwise voluminous in the case of natural gas, and they're difficult to transport. And the reason I make this last point is because it turns out, in my opinion, that the actual movement and transportation of fossil fuels is really the key to understanding how our energy economy works, and therefore how our climate economy works. And so what we're going to try to do over the course of the next, call it 10 minutes or so, is do a quick tutorial in the way that our energy economy works with respect to the physical movement of energy commodities, of fossil fuel commodities in this state. So fossil fuels, what are they good for? Practically everything, as it turns out. Oil, there are three of them: oil, natural gas, and coal. Oil is refined into the gasoline that powers most, but not all cars these days, diesel for trucks, jet fuel, other forms of transportation fuel. It's also processed into petrochemicals like plastics. Natural gas, you may be familiar from if you have a natural gas stove. It also provides space and water heating in buildings, and it's also processed into petrochemicals for a whole variety of purposes, including fertilizer and plastics and a bunch of other things. Coal is on the way out, as I think most people know, even who aren't sort of professional students of the energy economy. It's burned in power plants to generate electricity. It's also used in a few industrial processes like making steel, cement, and sometimes glass. So that's the quick overview of what fossil fuels are. They touch our lives in lots and lots of ways, and they are interwoven into our economy in lots and lots of ways. But again, like I said before, they're not magic. And a lot of the uses of fossil fuels are already transitioning to other cleaner forms of energy. And I'm responding to one of the things in chat real quickly. When we say clean energy in the climate context, generally we're talking about energy that doesn't produce carbon emissions, even though they may have other environmental impacts, sometimes tremendous environmental impact. Fossil fuels in Washington. We do not have a lot of fossil fuels in Washington relative to other states or other regions. The biggest thing that we have in this state are 5 oil refineries on Puget Sound. 4 of them are big, 1 small. We have a couple oil pipelines, not very big ones, and what we call product pipelines. Those are pipelines that move the refined oil products, so gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and so forth. And if you live near Puget Sound, you may have seen tanker vessels. We have marine vessels transporting oil on our water. Natural gas, we have power plants that generate electricity that provide a fraction of our electricity in the state. And we have natural gas. If you live in an urbanized area, there's probably natural gas pipelines under your street, and they provide heating to buildings and some other uses. Coal, there is 1 power plant that used to generate electricity, and it's used in very niche industrial processes. Coal doesn't matter in Washington state. Coal doesn't really actually matter in many places at all. I work in West Virginia quite a bit. Coal is actually on the way out, even in Appalachia, just because it can't compete in the market anymore with cheaper energy, natural gas, and also solar and wind. And increasingly, it's just not used that much anymore, except for a few, again, niche sort of industrial applications. So when we're thinking about fossil fuels in Washington, we're really just thinking about those top 2, oil and natural gas, and particularly those refineries, those pipelines, those power plants. That's the stuff that powers Washington's economy, has in the past to a degree, and that we have to think about from the perspective of how the energy actually moves there and how do we replace it with other stuff. So now, having said all that, I love energy and I love thinking about energy and climate. But historically, Washington's energy economy has not been that important. We're sort of a footnote in the larger story of energy. Our power system has for a long time been dominated by renewable energy, particularly hydropower. We have a clean electricity system relative to other states. It's getting cleaner all the time. Soon it will be 100% powered by renewable energy. We don't produce any oil or gas in the state. There's no oil or gas drilling at all in Washington. We don't mine any coal. We used to mine tiny amounts of coal. So we haven't mattered at all. And if you read books about energy, if you talk to the energy, trade press, they talk about the refineries occasionally, but nobody has really cared about us. And that was true up until about 10 years ago, when everything changed all of a sudden. And then we mattered a lot. And then we became one of the most important places in the whole world for the energy economy. I don't have time tonight to go into the full explanation for what exactly happened, but suffice it to say that there was a big transformation in the North American energy economy driven by fracking. And what that did was it put us in this hot seat between, on the right side there are the biggest energy reserves, some of the biggest energy reserves anywhere in the world, tar sands in Canada, Bakken oil in North Dakota, Powder River Basin coal, big gas fields also in Canada, and some of the fastest growing energy markets in Asia. And there were all of a sudden in Washington, as well as Oregon and British Columbia, just a deluge of proposals to move huge quantities of fossil fuels through the state, way out of proportion to anything that this region's ever seen before, way out of proportion to really anything else going on globally. Over the course of the last 10 years, we looked at new proposals for petrochemical refineries, including some of the biggest in the world, coal trains, including some of the biggest coal export facilities anywhere in the world, oil trains, including the biggest oil train projects anywhere in the world, big expansion of oil pipelines, and some big expansions of natural gas pipelines as well. I'm kind of ticking through this pretty fast, and I realize that some of it may seem like jargon, but the takeaway is huge. And I won't bother to kind of go through each of the kind of breakdowns of this stuff, but it would have radically transformed Washington State into a place that hasn't really mattered to the energy economy and that has a relatively clean energy portfolio relative to other places, into a place that looks a lot more like Houston or a lot like the Gulf Coast, where it's actually an epicenter of fossil fuel movement and production and export. That has been something I've been attending to for the last 10 years. A lot of other folks have as well. So on the left-hand side here, I'm not trying to show you too many charts tonight, but on the left-hand side, the blue bar is Washington's current greenhouse gas emissions. The red bar are new fossil fuel projects proposed for the Northwest in the last 10 years. All of those red projects are fossil fuel transportation projects, all of them. And all of them would have been in addition to what we currently do in Washington. So they dwarf Washington's entire emissions portfolio conservatively by 8 times. Probably the real answer is more like 9, 10, 11, 12 times. I'd be happy to make the analytical case for that later on. And so what really matters from a climate perspective is not just what we do with the greenhouse gases that we emit inside Washington State, but how we allow our infrastructure to be used and developed to transport fossil fuels to other places, because that's a much, much bigger deal. It's almost an order of magnitude bigger than the actual emissions in this state. To give you one example, the amount of coal that was proposed for export from Washington, so coal mined in Wyoming, exported through Washington to Asia, would have been equivalent to all the gasoline in all of those states on a yearly basis. Year of coal exports, year of gasoline consumed in those states. This is why transportation of fossil fuels matters, in my perspective. I'll skip this one because it's too confusing, but suffice it to say, one petrochemical refinery that was proposed recently in Kalama would have used more natural gas than every major city in the Northwest combined by a long shot. So what we're talking about in terms of fossil fuel transportation and new fossil fuel projects, again, dwarfs the entire portfolio of emissions that are already in the state. So I'm going to move quickly to the end here because I don't actually have all that much left to do, but I will say this. I have a strong opinion about these matters, and I'm going to share it with you now. The wrong way to reduce carbon emissions is to build clean energy projects and hope that fossil fuels go away. Now, building clean energy projects, by clean energy, I mean energy projects that don't emit carbon, that may be a good thing. I think it is a good thing. I think it's strongly a good thing, but they do not by itself make fossil fuels go away. So when President Obama was in office, he used to have what he called the all of the above energy policy, which was build more renewables, build more clean energy, frack for natural gas, do a bunch of other stuff too. But that makes absolutely no sense from a climate perspective. It's nonsense. It may make good sense from a political perspective, but it's terrible climate policy. The only correct approach to dealing with carbon emissions is to decarbonize. And so you can't have a portfolio of Washington's greenhouse gas emissions where all the fossil fuel transport proposed through Washington that looks like it does, and not actually attend to the project itself of dealing with those carbon emissions from fossil fuels, because the story is about fossil fuels. And if you don't address fossil fuels directly, then you can build all the windmills and all the solar panels you want, but you're still going to have the same carbon emissions, or they're going to go down sort of gradually in response to market forces and other trends, which are often very, very distorted. The right way to reduce carbon emissions, in my opinion, is to think directly about fossil fuels and about the fossil fuel infrastructure that enables it to be mined, extracted, delivered, and burned. Because that, again, is 85% of Washington's climate portfolio. And as we know, as we've just seen from the slides, the Northwest's proposals for new fossil fuel infrastructures dwarf that by 10 times. So the key to reducing carbon emissions, in my opinion, is number one, to stop expanding fossil fuel infrastructure. We've already got a huge problem. If you're stuck in the bottom of a hole, stop digging. That's where we are now. We need to stop digging. We've mostly done that, not entirely. And then we need to carefully, systematically, and thoughtfully begin to retire and then dismantle the existing fossil fuel infrastructure that we have. That's the pipelines, that's the refineries, the gas-fired, coal-fired power plants, which we're already working on, and even the natural gas that goes into our homes right now, and replace that with low carbon and zero carbon forms of energy that provide the same benefits and uses that fossil fuels do, but without the carbon emissions. Those are the two keys: stop expanding and then begin dismantling. And with that, I'm going to call it a day. My name is Eric DePlace. Again, I'm with Sightline Institute, of a couple other affiliations too. I would be happy to talk with anybody after this. I love talking about energy and climate policy, as you can probably tell. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. I hope it's been informative. I know I talk fast and I've raced through kind of a dense presentation. So good luck with the rest of the events, and thanks for your time.
Okay, and we're going to move right into the next presentation here, David Mendoza, who's presenting on environmental justice policies and opportunities in the legislative session as an expert presenter. David's a director of advocacy engagement in the Washington chapter of Nature Conservancy, overseeing state and federal lobbying and policy communications staff. The learning objective here is to learn about environmental justice and how it can manifest in climate mitigation policies at the state level, the Environmental Justice Task Force, and upcoming priorities. I'll turn it over to you, David.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking up these issues. So yes, I'm talking about the Environmental Justice Task Force today. I was the co-chair of the Environmental Justice Task Force for a little over a year, where we traveled across the state and learned about a lot of these issues and made recommendations to the governor and legislature. And this is usually an hour presentation, so I'm going to be steaming through a lot of components of it. Okay, a good starting point, I think, is this slide, because there's a lot of questions. What is equitable policy? What is environmental justice? What is climate justice? So this is my own take on things, but equity kind of surrounds all of these things, where the equitable policy is really focused on trying to seek to ameliorate, eliminate usually systemic racist disparities, right? So health disparities that result, income inequality, all these kinds of things fall in this housing issues, all these things fall in the broader umbrella of equity. Environmental justice itself is a concept that developed in the early 80s, and that focuses on addressing environmental health disparities, usually health disparities resulting from pollution or living near toxic sites. And then climate is a further subset of that, which is focused on mitigating the impacts of climate change. So environmental justice is the belief that where you live, your income, your race, your language, ability should not determine the health or safety of you and your family. The environmental justice movement has been led by African Americans, Latinos, Asians. Really started in North Carolina in the early 80s, related to like setting a garbage dump in a rural community, a Black rural community. And it grew from there and quickly grew into the 90s. The executive order in different states have taken actions, and the movement itself has grown to national networks. Every state tends to have some sort of environmental justice advocacy organization. These are a couple of examples of environmental justice organizations here in Washington. These are some actions Washington state government has taken, and it hasn't been a whole lot, a lot of high level guidance, not a lot of stuff in law. We don't have a definition of environmental justice in state law. We don't have an agency whose focus is pushing towards environmental justice, as an example. Well, but we've had, a lot of work that identifies the problems and potential ways to address them. One really key factor, and you'll probably hear a lot from my former colleague Samir when he presents, I believe, at your last session. Front and Center was an organization I worked before the Nature Conservancy for a few years. And one project they developed that took them about 3 years was this environmental health disparities map, along with these organizations here. And what it did, it took these different data points that you see on the screen, diesel emissions, particulate matter, lead exposure, but also things about sensitive populations, about cardiovascular diseases, low birth weight, educational attainment, linguistic isolation, poverty, and created kind of a ranking file using this and created a disparity rank. So every census tract in our state can has a score of 1 through 10. 1, you're pretty healthy, there's no little health disparities, decent levels of income, education. And 10, you have high levels of health disparity, likely to have high presence of communities of color, low education, right? And so you tend to have more problems the higher you go on that scale. And what we had some data to show what are the actual impacts, right? You see, as you move up the scale, you see higher amounts of communities of color. So that's one of the fundamental premises of environmental justice is one of the number one factor in determining kind of your health based on the community you live in is going to be race. You're going to live in an unhealthy community if you're living in a community. There's also actual life and death issues, right? So if you live in a 1, you're actually living a couple years longer than the average life expectancy in Washington. But if you live in a community that's at a 10, you're expecting to live close to 4 years less than the average lifespan in Washington. And you're going to have higher poverty rates, right? You can see that, not quite the clear line, but generally trending up as you get through a higher ranking on the environmental health disparity map. When I started at Front and Centered, saw this really powerful tool, and I was worried, and I think the whole organization was worried it would just sit on a shelf and maybe reference to. And so we looked for ways, how can we make this really powerful data that really centers and identifies the impacts communities of color are facing in government? And so the idea that was conceived was called the Healthy Environment for All Act, where we define environmental justice, we require agencies to use this, we would focus their work on reducing health disparities. We didn't get all the way in that process. We actually had 2 floor votes where we actually, different versions of the bill passed each of the houses, but the same kind of bill didn't pass the other house. But we were able to get an aspect of that bill that was always in the bill. It was the Environmental Justice Task Force. Because the key aspect of setting our ground and understanding this was having agencies learn from community and from each other on how to implement this goal moving forward. So we had this Environmental Justice Task Force, met from September 2019 to October 2020, where we had community, business, labor, agencies all at the table. When we could travel across the state, we would. We would have community, Front and Centered would sponsor community conversations in advance of the task force to have just like let folks know what we were doing at the task force and drive kind of turnout so they can share their stories of the impacts they're seeing to that community itself. So we did all that work. We had subcommittees that did a ton of work too, and ended up making a number of recommendations, which I'll touch on right now. I put on the screen the definition of environmental justice. The first sentence you see there, this is an older version, actually, it's spoken, it's not a full sentence, but all the words up until environment regulations and policy is kind of already in an executive order from the Environmental Protection Agency instituted by President Clinton, who set up that definition. We thought it was missing one aspect. One important aspect of environmental justice is the process, who you're including, who you're bringing to the table, who you're trying to adjust your policy to. The second is the actual actions you're taking. That those actions taken should address disproportionate environmental health impacts in these communities, including how we distribute resources and benefits and eliminate harm. We set a set of environmental justice principles of wanting to achieve highest attainable environmental quality for outcomes. These kind of principles go a little bit deeper than a definition to help provide some guidance to agencies as they kind of move forward with implementation. This is how we broke down our recommendations. So we had 4 different buckets, right? So improving government accountability community. That's tracking, communicating progress in a permanent environmental justice work group, incorporating environmental justice into government structures, systems, and policies, embedding into agency strategic plans, dedicated staff for those agencies, incorporating EJ and state environmental laws, investing equitably. How can the state take its resources that it currently has and more specifically dedicated and where the resources are needed the most, and then improving environmental enforcement. What can we do to improve the laws we have in the books and communicate to the public how they can report crimes and how they can get investigated and move forward on those actions. And across all these recommendations are 2 areas of subcommittees worked on about how can government better engage community and how can then the current environmental health disparity map be best utilized by agencies in their work. And also overarching this is the Government Accountability for Racial Equity has this process of an equitable policy toolkit, an equitable policy process where you kind of do your quantitative and qualitative, right? Your data and your conversations with impacted communities to understand conditions on the ground. You design strategic goals and objectives to advance environmental justice. You create like a measurement. How do you know when you meet success? And you start moving forward, right? Then you monitor and evaluate progress. You report back to communities. From that reporting back and analyzation, you then kind of start over, continue this kind of constant process of learning and improving. A little bit more in each of these recommendations that we made. Measuring goals and progress. I think one of the things that we don't know is like, we want to make sure as we move forward with this work, our health disparities being addressed. Are agencies actually investing in these communities? How can we get public tools or publicly facing tools so that folks can know where the action actually being taken from the guidance they're provided? So one of the big benefits on this also is creating a permanent interagency work group. What happens too often in government is agencies work in their silos, they're not talking to each other, impacts small community organizations who get reached out by these different agencies, ask them to educate them on things like environmental justice, and we get overburdened with that work. We think there's a lot of information sharing that they can benefit by sitting at the same table, learning from each other, and learning from community. We need to incorporate this work. So it's not a tacked on. The concerns of impacted community shouldn't be like, we're going to design a policy and then tack on that concern of community's color at the end. No, it should be done from the beginning. Those concerns that are faced by these overburdened communities should be baked into the process from the start. And so how do we see, these are some ideas of where we can agencies to start thinking about this as a core part of their work, embedding it into their strategic plans. Having staff that's dedicated to this work so they can work with and educate other folks who don't have this perspective and this experience and start helping them along on their process. And then incorporating it into state law. We have a number of state laws that have processes that don't really take into account the impacts of communities. Okay, my warning here. Investing equitably. I think this is really important. We need to have an environmental justice analysis required for things like, how do you do policy? How do you do enforcement so you're focusing in the right areas? How can we distribute current resources and new sources of revenue and dedicate a portion of those to the most impacted communities? One recommendation too was about we need to understand reparations as well, and we recommended a task force for reparations. Redlining and where communities live and how they've been impacted because of that, because of racism, because of systemic racism, is something that should be addressed in our state. We also want to address enforcement, ensuring that we have accessible tools for folks to report things, and also the folks that understand what happens. These are ways that the EJ map itself can be best utilized by agencies. In the map, this is tools of ways agencies can improve their community engagement that are gone into more detail. And then I just want to wrap up here on what's happening with this work. We've seen agencies already start to take up this work during our process, learn from each other. For example, the Department of Commerce has developed a strategic plan on clean energy for the state, and incorporated a lot of the work that we did in that process. These bills that you see in front of you, the HEAL Act, it's the new version of that. It actually takes a lot of these components that I just talked about and putting them into law, creating an EJ community council to help manage and oversee this work to ensure agencies follow through on it. Urban and community forestry is something that the Department of Natural Resources has a program of increasing tree canopy throughout different urban communities across the state. They want to use the environmental health disparity map and understand how they can prioritize the investments into those communities that most need that and most need this kind of investment. These last two bills are two different types of carbon pricing proposals that the legislature is considering, a straight up carbon tax and another cap and trade program. Really complicated, both of them. But I think the key components to consider is both of them are considering dedicated and up to 35 to 40% of all the revenue raised from those proposals dedicated to overburdened communities, with significant with EJ community councils helping guide the formation as we're advocating for them. They're not quite there yet, to guide the formation and of these programs, from the rulemaking process all the way to how investments are structured and distributed. And that was the fastest I've ever done that. Thank you all. I'm happy to stay and answer questions for that section. And
all right, we are going to move directly into the Q&A portion of this. And so we'll be getting our panel of each of the presenters together. So we're also joined by Eric and Lauren as well. And I'll dive right into the first question that we've got. This is a question for Lauren from Barry from Bellevue. In the Seattle Times this morning, the Seattle City Council is changing energy codes, mostly around natural gas. With the goal of Seattle being carbon neutral by 2015 and with the state legislature setting climate policy, does the Seattle model conflict or complement the goal of reducing greenhouse gases with all the other work and bills being presented to state legislature?
Thanks. And can you restate just the very first sentence, because I missed it because I was trying to get on video.
Okay, yeah. The Seattle City Council is changing energy codes, mostly around natural gas.
Yeah, and how that aligns. Sorry, can you restate?
Yeah, does it conflict or is it complementary to what is being proposed at the state level?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I don't know the exact details if it's like complementary in like a policy way, but I would say generally it is complementary. I think we need city-wide action, regional action, and statewide. So I do think it is complementary, but I don't know the exact details of how the statewide new natural gas bill for buildings would interact with the city level. So I wouldn't know the exact answer to that, but I believe they are complementary, but don't.
And Eric, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, sure. So real quickly, the state basically sets building codes. They set a building code floor for the state. For residential buildings, that is the standard that cities must abide by for the most part. For commercial buildings and some other buildings, cities can go farther and create more aggressive building, like more energy efficient building codes. And so that's what Seattle has done, is they've gone beyond the state standard to amp up basically the building standards for commercial buildings and large residential buildings. And so it's complementary in the sense that it's kind of moving that one building sector ahead faster than the rest of the state.
Okay. Next question here is also for Lauren, and this is from Steve from Bellevue. How do you keep the effects of any carbon use taxes equitable when businesses would likely pass on their expenses to the consumer?
Yeah, so there are many ways to deal with, in 1631, for example, when utilities, there was the fear that if the carbon fee was passed, that utilities would put back the cost back on consumers, same with fossil fuel, same with gas. But for utilities, the way that we were dealing with that is to implement also the working families tax credit, so that families below a certain threshold of income would actually receive a financial tax break. And then also the bill would require not actually increase utility costs on their low income consumers. So there are ways that there can be, in policy mitigation against that. And that's an example. David could probably add to that, honestly.
yeah, I would say the kind of most recent idea on addressing that in the current legislation be considered is to fund the working family tax credit. This is something that's been on the books. It's a state equivalent of the earned income tax credit, but it's never been funded for over a decade. And so that's one idea, is to fund that through carbon revenue. And then that's a way to help mitigate any additional costs related to carbon prices.
Next question is from Corby from Linden, and this is for Eric. How do we ensure that by cracking down on refineries in Washington state, they just don't move their facilities elsewhere in states with less regulation on the industry, therefore just moving the problem and the money they bring to our state?
Yeah, Corby, that's a great question. I saw it in chat, and it gets right to the heart of the problem. So the oil refineries in Washington state, there are 4 big ones, 2 of them in Skagit County, 2 of them in Whatcom County. They employ a lot of people at high wages. A lot of them are union jobs. Most of them are union jobs. They provide a lot of tax revenue to the communities, and they are actually critical components of our economy right now. So when we talk about decarbonization, it is easy to sort of sweep it aside and say, well, we'll just get rid of the refineries. But that's actually not very simple at all. And so the question you're asking is dead on point. Now, but the problem is actually a little bit, I think, different than the way the question is framed, which is right now, the refineries in Washington state take crude oil from other places, mostly from North Dakota and Alaska. They refine it, and they sell that refined product to basically the rest of Oregon, all of Washington, and British Columbia. So if we decommission those refineries, somebody else would step into the market, maybe. So what we want to do is decommission those refineries over some time horizon while we are transitioning the transportation sector off of the refined product from that stuff. If you just deleted the refineries, somebody else would sell into the market at a higher price. It would drive up costs. There is all kinds of dislocation to this stuff. It's really hard to give a succinct answer to this right away, but suffice it to say that the challenge is that if we decarbonize the entire state's economy, right? Like we want all electric vehicles, and we made everything in our state carbon free, but we left the refineries running. What they would do is continue to take that crude oil, refine it into product, and sell it to the rest of the world. And so, so that's actually the risk that's in front of us right now, is that they'll continue to operate and we'll look like we're carbon free. This is what British Columbia looks like. They look like they're low carbon, but in actual fact, British Columbia and Washington could be this in the future, is a major purveyor of carbon to the rest of the world. So what we want to do is come up with policies that reduce the emissions in Washington, and then also take a gradual transitional approach to dismantling that infrastructure. But you got to do it in a way that takes care of the local economies and the workers and the rest of it, because those are big, big challenges. And it's a great question that I could dig into, with more time, but I don't, I got to be too brief on this, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's a great reminder to try to keep responses succinct. We have a lot of questions we'd like to get through with you all. So this next question is for David and Eric from Pedro from Birch Bay. Why is it that no one seems to want to talk about nuclear power as a way to decarbonize power generation? Bill Gates promotes TerraPower out of Bellevue, Washington, traveling wave reactor as a way to use up existing nuclear waste to power these reactors. I agree that nuclear power has many political issues in the past and in the present, but the technology has been redefined. And then the question here is, what would any of you explain why this is politically untouchable? And also a piece here is discussion as a way to promote environmental justice and cheaper decarbonized power.
Yeah, I mean, I think my short answer is it still has its own kind of environmental effects, right? I think, yes, it is carbon free, but what we do with the waste that comes from nuclear power is a concern, a long-term concern of how we store and manage that. And we're uncertain about that kind of impacts. And I think that's, it has been kind of, it's allowed as to be a clean energy under the 100% Clean Energy Act. But I think environmental organizations in general tend to not want to get behind it because of the other kinds of impacts you could have through broader use.
The version of the response that I'll give is, I don't think it's a political problem so much as an economic problem. Nuclear power, even in the new generation, is extremely expensive relative to other forms of energy. So if you're competing right now to supply, nuclear power would mostly be used to generate electricity. So you have to price into a market where natural gas is at incredibly cheap prices, and solar and wind are underpricing now. Coal can't compete in this environment at all. So Bill Gates he's a smart guy, but the problem is that it's not so much political. I mean, it's allowed under Washington state's and virtually every state's energy portfolios, but it can't compete in the market. And that's because one of the reasons is that it's almost impossible to insure. You can't get private insurance for it because when you go to your local insurer to come up with a backstop policy for running your nuke reactor, the price goes way, way up. So it's an economic problem, in my judgment, more than it's a political problem. Energy's cheap. That's the major problem for it.
Okay, next question here is Steve from Bellevue, and this is a question for David. Are there policies not directly related to climate change mitigation that set us up for more equitable mitigation? The example given, lowering our sales tax and adding state income tax.
So equitable policy kind of in general, is that?
Yes.
Lost track of that.
Are
Yeah.
there policies not directly related to climate mitigation that set us up for more equitable mitigation?
Yes, I think so. The legislature in this kind of virtual session that we're in because of COVID is trying to limit what it's able to do this. And so both the House and Senate have said we're working on a few major things, right? COVID response, obviously, climate and equity is kind of our guiding lights. And so you have things like efforts on police reform moving through the legislature. You have really big ideas on how to restructure our tax reform. Today, there was a hearing on a billionaire's tax, right? There'd be a 1% tax levied on people who have over $1 billion in intangible assets in the state. That alone could raise $2.5 billion. So there's a number of ideas out there. There's an equity and farming bill of how do we get more diverse folks into farming idea. Those are just off the top of my head, but there's a lot out there.
Okay, thank you. Next question here, Chris from Linwood, this is to any of our panelists here. Many presenters have noted that growing government is the answer and to help these communities. How do we stop growing government and additional bureaucracy and turn to actionable items on the front line without this gigantic overhead? Who would like to take that first?
Well, I mean, one of our main recommendations is, one thing, as I think government, it can be, when done well, is a force for good, right? And how it's serving the will of the people when it's done right. But I think one of the main recommendations we have in the Environmentalist Task Force report isn't about like adding new agencies. It's how do we integrate this work into current work and make it more efficient that way by addressing the problems, right? By that way. And also, one of our recommendations is about, instead of having government staff do this community outreach, why don't we contract with local community groups who have those relationships, who can handle that community outreach and relationships and bring people into the fold to help inform government themselves. So we're not just adding staff to the outreach, we're actually trying to support and build those local communities. My answer.
Great. Thank you so much. We are going to move straight into our next set of presentations. So at this time, that concludes our Q&A. Did you have a final thought that you wanted to share, Eric, or are you just waving goodbye?
Just waving goodbye. Appreciate
Okay.
your time, folks.
Okay, and with that, we are going to move into our next set of presenters. As you'll notice, we're doing 2 Q&A portions today, and we are ready to share our next presentation. Let me know when we're ready. Great. The next presenter is Tim Trhomovich, presenting on community organizing and the Growth Management Act as an expert presenter. Tim is currently the Director of Planning and Law of FutureWise, where he focuses on policy, education, technical assistance, and land use and environmental law. The learning objective here is to learn about priorities and opportunities in the Growth Management Act and its update and how it can support climate mitigation policies. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tim.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you tonight. Oops, assuming I can calibrate my flipping to this version of the presentation. So thank you for having me, and I especially look forward to your questions. The Growth Management Act is a statewide law that manages planning in Washington state. Before the Growth Management Act, lots of counties and cities had comprehensive plans, which are a plan for the physical development of the community. Lots of local governments had zoning, but there were very few state standards on how to manage those plans. There are also very few tools that local governments had. In Washington state, for example, you could only adopt transportation impact fees. You couldn't have other impact fees, which is a way that development can help contribute to the infrastructure that is needed to support growth. After the Growth Management Act was passed, different requirements were adopted for different jurisdictions. The green counties do the full deal, which I'll talk about that in a moment. Blue counties opted in, they also do the full deal. And the gray counties are referred to as the Carl counties. They identify and conserve critical areas. They designate their agricultural lands. The full deal is that the counties and cities in a county, or in the case of King, Pierce, and Snohomish County and Kitsap County, come together as a region and adopt a countywide policies as a framework for county and city planning. They then designate and protect critical areas. Critical areas are areas that are either hazardous to build on or that are beneficial for the functions they provide. Wetlands, for example, are a critical area. They're both hazardous to build on because your building might sink into the bog, but they also provided really important benefits such as storing drinking water and letting it percolate into the aquifers so that we can have it in the fall when we need it, and also in the summer we need it. They designate and conserve agricultural, forest, and mineral resource lands of long-term commercial significance so that we can continue to grow food, that we can continue to grow forest products, that we can get the minerals and the gravel that we need and the sand that we need. They designate urban growth areas. These are the areas that are intended for intense urban development. This is where towns and cities are. This is where you're going to see the kinds of residential, commercial, and industrial uses that are characteristic of our towns and characteristics of our cities. The local governments then prepare and adopt a comprehensive plan. Often that includes a vision for the future. How are you going to transform the physical development of the community to get the future that the community wants? Once these plans are adopted, they're continuously evaluated and updated at least once every 8 or 10 years, depending on your population and how quickly you're growing. And they're required to provide for continuous public involvement. You need to involve the community in the development of these plans, involve the community in their evaluation and their amendment. Well, you're probably thinking that's all great, but what does that have to do with reducing greenhouse gas pollution? And I think this chart shows it well. This is the inventory data published by our Department of Ecology, and the graph was prepared by the Seattle Times. And as you can see, our two largest sectors in terms of greenhouse gas pollution are transportation in residential, commercial, industrial buildings. And not only are they the largest, but as you can see from the numbers there, they're increasing, they're not decreasing. And as you've heard from the other presenters and ones that you've had, what we need to do is reduce our greenhouse gas pollution. Well, how does the Growth Management Act do that? The Growth Management Act has goals to reduce sprawl, to encourage efficient multimodal transportation systems, biking, walking, or actually bicycling. My bicycle allies hate it when I say biking. Bicycling, walking, transit, carpools, van pools, multimodal systems that give people transportation choices. And then a goal to protect the environment. And that includes protecting the environment from air pollution, including greenhouse gas pollution. There are requirements such as protecting and avoiding critical areas, including wetlands and floodplains. The science shows us, and I know you don't want to talk about adaptation, but the science shows us that we're getting more rain, we're going to have more floods, and so we want to make sure that people don't end up like the little picture on the right, where they're flooded out because of sea level rise or because of flooding. The Growth Management Act also requires the conservation of farms and forests and wetlands and marine habitats. And in addition to providing us with food and forest products, these areas also sequester carbon. So while we're generating carbon, these areas bind it up and lock it up if we manage them correctly. There are also planning requirements that can help reduce greenhouse gas pollution. This includes focusing and increasing urban densities in cities to support transit and to conserve farms, forests, and critical areas. Urban planning approaches that promote physical activity. This provides people opportunities to walk and bike, to go to the store, to go to work, and to come home. And then multimodal transportation systems that give us transportation choices and allow us to use systems that use less carbon. And in some cases, such as electrified light rail, very little carbon. The Growth Management Act also encourages things that aren't required, but cities and towns are encouraged to provide a mix of uses, greater densities, and developments without required parking around transit stations. This can reduce housing costs, but it also has the opportunity to give us different transportation choices and again, reduce the pollution from our transportation. It also calls for more housing and more affordable housing close to jobs so that again, commutes are reduced. You can perhaps be close enough to take alternative transportation modes and we can also get more housing affordability. Oops. Well, what happens if a local government doesn't comply with the Growth Management Act? The main way that the Growth Management Act is enforced is appeals to a state agency called the Growth Management Hearings Board. And you can appeal a failure to conduct that 8 or 10-year review I mentioned. You can appeal a failure to properly designate urban growth areas for intense housing and jobs and retail, those urban uses. If the local government doesn't include provisions that need to be included in the comprehensive plan that have been adopted into the Growth Management Act since their last update, you can appeal that. And then you can also appeal provisions that were actually amended by the county or city. But as you can tell from my graph, this isn't good enough. Our emissions from transportation and our emissions from buildings are going up. And so we've got a new bill proposed in the state legislature. Oops, I can't remember the name of it. There it is. All right, HB 1099. It's sort of blocked out by the menu at the top, which is sponsored by Representative Davina Dewar and Representative Joe Fitzgibbon. It would amend the Growth Management Act to require King, Snohomish, Pierce, Kitsap, Thurston, Clark, Whatcom, Spokane, Benton, and Franklin counties to plan to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions consistent with the state reduction requirements in state law. It would also require those counties and the cities in those counties to reduce the vehicle miles traveled consistent with the state benchmarks for reducing vehicle miles traveled. Again, the idea here is that we would reduce greenhouse gas pollution from buildings. We would reduce greenhouse gas pollution from transportation. All fully planning counties and cities, not just these 10 counties, but all of them would be required to address climate hazards such as sea level rise, increased floodings, more intense storms, less water available in the summer and fall, and wildfires. And unlike the current situation where state agencies don't review and approve comprehensive plans, our Washington State Department of Commerce would review and, if they're acceptable, approve these climate elements. In addition to that, the bill also requires all fully planning counties and cities to give special consideration to achieving environmental justice and avoiding health disparities heard about from some of our earlier presenters. We're very excited about this we're actually excited about all of these provisions because they will greatly improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the Growth Management Act. But we're also excited about the environmental justice requirement because right now the Growth Management Act has no provisions related to environmental justice. And so we think it's a really important change. It's probably 20 years it should have happened 20 years ago, but we're happy that it's moving forward now. Well, you're probably thinking to yourselves, hundreds and hundreds of bills are introduced every year. Why do we think we've got a chance to pass HB 1099? Well, one, we've got good sponsors. The bill was prepared by influential legislatures that are trusted by other legislators, and so that's really helpful. In addition to that, we're engaging in community organizing to pass HB 99. We worked and are still working to build a coalition that will support the bill and the complementary housing and environmental justice legislation. The Washington Can't Wait campaign is part of the Climate Alliance's Resilient Futures platform, as you heard before. We've got 63 partner organizations that are endorsed the bill and are working on it. We're working to educate the public and the members of various organizations through online educational sessions. Op-eds are being written and placed in news media across the state of Washington. We've got materials on websites. We're using word of mouth, which is one of the most effective ways there is to convince people that something is good, or that, for that matter, something is bad, because you're using trusted messengers that those people understand and rely on. We're using social media. We're using earned media. That is, we had press availabilities and articles are written. Articles are written about it, and so we're doing that. We're also building grassroots and local government support in key legislative districts. We've sent postcards to legislators that are actually our supporters have. They're emailing, writing, and calling. They're signing in favor of the bills, and our key allies are testifying at the legislative hearing. And that's what we're doing. Again, the Growth Management Act provides a guidepost for communities when they plan for their future by adopting better regulations that'll better be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we're using community organizing to do that. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, we're going to move straight into our next presenter tonight, and our final presenter for tonight, Dr. Vandana Astama, presenting on Washington's climate action in the broader international context as an expert presenter. Dr. Astana is a professor in the government department of Eastern Washington University. Her areas of research are in South Asian security with a focus on non-traditional threats and human security, with special reference to water, environment, and development. The learning objective here, learn about how Washington can be a leader in the US for climate action, framing it how policies can lead to benefits outside of Washington state, including for other states and provinces, and learn about how Washington state's ambitions fit within the broader international policy conversations about climate change. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting me in the first of a kind climate change assembly that's being held in Washington. I'm here to share some of my knowledge that I've gained through working in the environment and with specific reference to climate. My goal here is twofold. One, to give an understanding of the international context of climate change accords. And my second goal is to see how Washington fits into those international accords. My third goal, of course, is Washington a leader in terms of climate change mitigation, especially as far as the state, countries, and the world? A lot has already been said about the policies, so I'm not going to go into the details of the policy. I'm going to go ahead and just compare those policies in terms of the larger context, especially the Paris Agreement on climate change. I want to mention here that it wasn't until 1994 when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was held that nations actually for the first time acknowledged that there is human interference in the climate system and we need to go ahead and stop that. It was after that that states started to negotiate with each other, and two major accords that were signed were called the Kyoto, which was signed in 1997, operated in 2005, but was only limited to the developed world, and then the Paris Agreement on Climate, which was signed in 2015, authorized in 2016, and covers the whole world, both the rich and the poor nations. In both of these, it was acknowledged that climate change is a global problem. It requires global solutions, but at multiple scales. So everyone, everywhere has a role to play in mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. One of the things that we also want to know is that we are at a stage where warming is at 1 degree centigrade. And this is a chart that was presented in the Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change Report, which is actually showing us that even at 1 degree centigrade, there are areas which are at moderate and high risk as far as climate impacts and the greenhouse gas emissions are concerned. So if we move over to 1.5 and then later to 2, we are definitely going to see more rising temperatures and rising risks. So the Paris Climate Agreement was formed with the intention of limiting the world greenhouse gas emissions to 2 degrees centigrade of pre-industrial levels. And the purpose was that many states were concerned, especially low-lying states. So the assumption was, let's keep it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this climate agreement is one of the world's most comprehensive climate agreements, and it pledges nationally determined contributions of states, which are based on the socioeconomic and political context of each state as to how much the state would like to reduce. There's no penalty out here. There is a name and shame provision, as the UN Secretary General said, or we could also call it a name and encourage provision if states don't meet those requirements. There's also a process of global stocktake, which is supposed to be held in 2023 to ensure what path states have taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then there's a provision for Green Climate Fund that is a provision towards environmental and climate justice issues in relation to the developed world and the developing world. This is the global emissions pathway that the IPCC report spoke to as to where the world needs to be. And in terms of Washington, if I can mention here, Washington is trying to follow pathway 2, where it wants to reduce around 45% of its emission in 2030 and then 95% of its emissions by 2040. Following this pathway is we want to ask ourselves, how does Washington fit into larger Paris climate goals? If we look at the Paris climate goals and if we look at climate action goals of Washington state, we can kind of see that in terms of goals, Washington state is trying to mirror the Paris Agreement goals. It wants to limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees. It wants to cut greenhouse gases in fossil fuel transportation and electricity. It's also has a focus on climate resilience and adaptation. It has an energy and climate policy meeting some of the energy and climate policies of Paris Agreement goals. And it has state-determined commitments that it wants to follow over the course of time to get to zero emissions in 2050. And more recently, there's been a strong emphasis on environmental justice and equity, which is a major goal of the Paris Agreement, which is tied to nations which are differentially being impacted by greenhouse gases and by global warming. So in terms of goals, we definitely see that Washington state kind of mirrors those goals, but we want to take a look at the policies as to where it stands in terms of emissions, mitigation, and adaptation. Most of the presenters have spoken to Washington emissions, and which will be followed by mitigation and adaptation. So I'm not going to go into the detail, but yes, the emissions have risen 1.3% since 2017, but Washingtonians need to think a little differently, even in the context of the larger world, as well as in the context of the United States of America. Most of the states and world states are looking at emission reduction, especially in terms of the electricity sector and the transportation sector, but Washington has been a lead state as far as clean energy is concerned, with about 69% coming from hydropower and then other renewables. So our focus has to be on transportation in the context of the larger world context. Here's a little graph that shows a case-wise projection of 1990 to 2005 and 2005 to 2020. And you can see that in areas of transport, in areas of ozone depletion substitutes, the HFCs in industrial processes, and residential fuels, there's been a net increase as far as greenhouse gas emissions are concerned in the period from 2005 to 2020. Although we're seeing reductions in fossil fuel industry, minor reductions in other industrial processes. So in terms of greenhouse gas reduction goals, we did see that Washington had created some goals from 2020 to 2015, 2008, but in order to reflect current science, especially after the 2018 IPCC report that said we have already at 1 degree centigrade and 1.5 to 2 is going to have catastrophic consequences, the Department of Ecology updated those goals. And so we can see that 2020 to 2050, there is a percentage emissions that need to be reduced, tying it to pathway 2 of the global emissions pathway and trying to bring it to net zero gas emissions. The question is, what has Washington done? The Paris Climate Change Agreement emphasizes that to get to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, we need huge transformations in the economic sector, including energy, building, industry, transportation, agriculture, and forestry. So has Washington achieved those goals in terms of policy initiative, practices, or future policies in place? This is a historical and projected cross emissions. And this kind of shows that Washington has been one of the first states to kind of lead and pass a legislation towards a clean energy economy. Moving forward, we also see Washington has been one of the major states. It's the 5th state in the United States. So therefore, I would consider it a lead state in terms of clean energy transformation. And there are many other states where such legislations are being enacted and where there is a conversation about clean energy transformation. These are some firsts. I'm not going to go into the details because of the shortage of time, but I do want to mention that Washington has been one of the first states to require public buildings to meet LEED standards, although currently, according to the United States Green Building Council, it's still not in the top 10 states. Seattle has been one of the first cities to enact a green building policy, and this has been followed by cities in San Francisco, in Chicago, in Salt Lake, Virginia, Charlottesville, etc. It also kind of is trying to lead the way on sustainable aviation fuels. It's one of the top 10 states as far as jet fuel is concerned. And so these are some examples where we kind of see that these policies and initiatives have been taken by the state administration. One of the most important elements that has been recently talked about is the Clean Energy Fund, which is a mirror goal of the Paris Agreement, which talks about a green climate fund. And the purpose of this green climate fund is to provide technology, capital, based on capacity of states in the world, largely tied to developing states and help them in terms of innovation and clean energy technology. Washington State has also created a clean energy fund dedicating $10.6 million in there. And this is obviously for grid modernization, solar projects, climate change planning grants, and greenhouse gas reduction grants, and electrification of the transport. So again, in terms of the larger concept, we definitely see that Washington is moving towards the Paris Agreement on climate change. One of the most important things that I wanted to emphasize here was that apart from the policies and initiatives that Washington has taken, Washington has encouraged other states in the nation to join some of the goals that Washington has been a co-founder of. The Pacific Coast Collaborative, the US Climate Alliance, which it co-founded with California and New York, the International Alliance on Ocean Acidification, again, which it co-founded with its Pacific Coast partners, are some of the alliances where Washington has led the initiative. But I want to mention here that in the Climate Change Alliance that began with 3 states has now 24 states following on the greenhouse gas reduction strategy that the Climate Alliance talks about. At the same time, these 24 states are half of US population and about 40% of US economy. So Washington has kind of led the nation in terms of moving towards these pathways of 1.5 degrees. Even in terms of the International Ocean Combat Acidification Alliance, we've kind of see that this alliance, it's a co-founder between these three states that Washington started, but today it has member countries from all over the world. Cities as well as many Washington states are part of this alliance. So it definitely has led the world and the United States in many moving forward greenhouse gas reduction policies, last of which is the UNDER 2, which is a memorandum which was signed between developing countries and developing states with Washington as to how to mitigate climate change. So one wonders, at its current rate, is Washington on track for the stated goal? If we look at the climate action and policy issues, we're going to see it is 9% above 2020 levels in terms of Paris climate change. It may not meet its goal in terms of 2035. It's a 40% reduction. We may meet 25 to 35%. We're kind of off track in terms of US short-term commitment as far as 26% below 2005 is concerned. And so that kind of raises the question that it's not really good news in terms of reaching the 1.5 degrees centigrade. And there are questions of policy that I can talk about in the question and answer session. We kind of talk about feasibility issues, the political will, equity, grants, and climate justice issues. So, but the good news is that the Climate Commitment Act that the state is pushing forward shows in terms of data that it may reach its goal in terms of 2030 by investing in transportation, healthy homes, and buildings. So when we are looking at the priorities, we can see the carbon intensity of transportation priorities is mobile gasoline and diesel. And so the next chart here kind of shows in terms of fuel priorities where policies should be initiated to get those kind of fuel standards to allow to mitigate those transportation. The residential bill has already been talked about. This is another bill which we add to reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that will help us reach the 2030 goal. The HEAL Act, David talked about that. But an important thing before I want to conclude is that Washington has a big challenge. In spite of all these efforts and in spite of climate priority being on top, what we're seeing is that Washington has not been able to decouple carbon emissions with economic growth. In the period of 2005 to 2017, data shows Washington economy was the third fastest in terms of GDP, but its emissions grew by 4%. In comparison to the northeastern states that have been largely able to decouple carbon emissions and economic growth, Washington has a task ahead to do that. So the last question, therefore, I want to kind of conclude with is that this was a Washington report that came out by the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group. We are on track, but we have no time to waste. We need to act soon. Yes, are these goals ambitious? They are ambitious because there are issues of scale, the issues of technology, the issues of feasibility, etc. But like the United Nations Secretary General said, that climate change is a race that we should win and we can win, but we have to step up the ambition now. Washington's stepped up the ambition, has moved towards those conversations, and will definitely be a leader, keeping in view the structural and social determinants and other variables that might play a role in implementing policy in Washington state. Thank you.
We are going to move right into the question and answer. We've got both Dr. Astama and Tim Trahomovich are here with us in the panel. And the first question we're going to ask is from Dustin from Richland. This is to Tim. The problem with the distance traveled issue is that it unjustly affects more rural areas where work is often not within short distance or public transportation. How will this be addressed?
Well, there are places that do have greater opportunity to use walking and biking. And so if you're in Richland, if you're in Seattle, if you're in Olympia, you do have greater opportunities to do that. If you're in Ferry County, it is harder to do it that way. That's why we need electric vehicles. We need all kinds of solutions. And so different jurisdictions are going to have to reduce emissions faster than others, but there are tools that we can spend throughout our state and throughout our economy that'll get us to our targets.
The next question is also for Tim. This is from Corby from Linden. Wouldn't reducing miles driven be better encouraged with incentives rather than regulation?
Incentives can help. The peer-reviewed science, though, shows that the way you structure your world really, really matters. If you can only afford a house an hour from your job, you're not going to be able to reduce your transportation emissions. We need to build more affordable housing closer to jobs. So the way we build our cities, the way we build our counties really matter for these. There was a peer-reviewed journal article published last year that showed we can only get to our reduction targets by having people closer to where they live. Not everybody, some people will still live an hour from their work or 2 hours, but by providing opportunities for more people to live closer to their jobs, to have more affordable housing closer to jobs, we can meet our targets. And we have to. The science shows us that we got to do that if we're going to meet our targets.
Next question is from a combined question from Dustin from Richland and Sue from Medical Lake. This is for Dr. Astana. Have studies been done of the correlation between economic growth and emissions? And how do we decouple economy and climate solutions?
So thank you for the question. Yes, there have been studies that have been done. A lot of Washington think tanks, as well as other nonprofit organizations, have kind of mapped these studies. And they have found that a good mix of technology, a good mix of market and policies will be able to help decouple carbon emissions from economic growth, because it's important that we need to grow economically yet reduce those carbon emissions. So investing in the right kind of technology in terms of which would definitely provide jobs and which would kind of also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, a good mix of market mechanisms. I know that the climate change, Paris climate change countries themselves are still fighting over a global carbon market, and they haven't yet come to a conclusion, and that's something that needs to be considered on the national level too, as well as Washington level. So, and obviously which would be tied to policy issues, but the challenge obviously is on questions of scale, other technologies on scale. How do we deal with local issues? What are the feasibility costs? What kind of value are we placing on non-market benefits that are tied to health, equity, etc.? So those are considerations that would be on the structural side, and on the other hand, we would have to look at the market and the technological side.
Another question for you, Dr. Astana, from Puneet from Sammamish. While we take all the initiatives around climate change, how are we helping countries like India and China manage the emissions? Unfortunately, their emissions are going up as developed nations keep shifting their manufacturing there.
Right, and that's one of the questions that I think are tied to the larger Paris Climate Change Agreement. And the argument that's been made is that, I mean, China is number one, India is number three right now, and with the offshoring and that's going on, how do these countries manage that? Because to them, economic growth becomes primary and environmental considerations are secondary, because poverty alleviation is one of the primary goals of developing countries. So in that sense, one of the agreements that the Paris climate change made was that developed countries would create this global environmental fund as well as the green climate fund, which would then help countries, even like India and China, to help them with technology, with clean coal, as far as manufacturing. These manufacturing companies are concerned, as well as electricity is concerned, and based on their capacity, they would provide them. And one of the arguments that these countries have definitely made is based on the polluter pay principle, that they believe that we've already that part of the world has already polluted, and therefore it's kind of we need to reach that level, and if we reach that level, the world will not be a place to live in. So there should be some help for capital, for technology, based on the capacity of these nations to be able to move towards greener technology. And India and China have actually submitted their nationally determined contributions to the Paris climate change. China has actually said it wants to go carbon neutral by 2060. I'm not sure how it's going to do that, but it has made that commitment.
Next question is also for you, Dr. Astana. This is from Lendwell from Camino Island. What do we do with the carbon emissions created by countries who are not trying to mitigate climate change?
And that's one of the biggest challenges. And I think there are a lot of economists that have argued that there should be some form of penalty, or there should be some form of incentives to kind of promote them towards those greenhouse gas reductions, because currently these nationally determined contributions are based on their political will and the economic context. And at the same time, there's no penalty. So there's no, if you default on those emissions, nothing can be done. The Kyoto Protocol, on the other hand, did have penalties and punishment, but it was only for developed countries. So in this case, there are two proposals that have been made. One, of course, is there should be some form of penalties and punishment, or there should be some form of threat of non-trading with those countries, as was done under the Montreal Accord, that with the threat that we wouldn't trade, many countries came on board to reduce ozone depleting substances and were able to meet those standards. So definitely, there is this penalty or incentives, giving them some credits in terms of like carbon trading, or giving them some credits as far as they're concerned. Mm-hmm.
And with that final question, that concludes our Q&A for the final portion for the night. And we will move directly into our next action item. And I'm going to turn this over to Emily Wright as part of the coordinating team for an activity. Emily?
Gretchen, thanks Tim, thanks Dr. Asmana for being here. So yes, we want to hear from you. I know that there's been a lot that you've taken in tonight, and we're going to get to campfire rooms, breakout rooms really soon. But before we do that, we wanted to give folks a chance to just check in like we tend to do at the beginning and the end of every meeting. And so we're asking you we're going to do a waterfall chat, which we've done before. And the question for this, well, the instructions first is to, once we ask the question, to type your answer into the chat, but don't press enter yet. And we'll count down from 3, 2, 1, and go. And at that time, you can press enter. So it's a way to kind of get all the information in all at once. So the question is, and again, type this in, but don't press enter yet. What is a question that's coming up for you right now? So you've heard a lot. It doesn't necessarily have to be toward presenters, but just a question that's kind of on your mind, something that you're curious about, something that you're wondering, especially thinking into the future, that in the next session is our last learning session. So I'll enter that in the instructions in the chat right there. So if you can start typing your answer, one question that's coming up for you. And I will count down. So on the go, you can press enter. I see people look like they're typing. All right, so 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, great. How long will it take to pass legislation that will start changing things? I'm seeing, what are the economic constraints to bootstrap environmentally sound solutions? I'm seeing, how are we going to be able to choose? Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people are feeling that way. How do we get past race issues and resolve the climate issues? How low-income people can afford e-cars, electric cars? These are a lot of really good questions. And hopefully you hear some of your own kind of thoughts brewing in them as well. So we're gonna go from here into breakout groups. And I hope you have a chance to kind of browse through the chat as well to look at what other people are thinking of and what's on people's minds. But we're gonna go straight into breakout groups. And for that, I'm just going to get the time set up. So it looks like we'll give folks about 7 minutes, and including the 60-second time to come back in. And Gretchen, can you just give me the go ahead that we're all set to go?
All set.
Okay, great. All right, see you in breakout rooms.
We're just waiting for folks to come back. Looks like the other breakout groups are just trickling back in right now. And Wendy, when you're back, if you can go ahead and put that link to the survey in the chat, if you're back. Short survey here. Folks should, as they're trickling in, and I'm going to turn it over to Mike for final comments. We're at time here. There is a link to the survey. If folks can, we had 25 people take it last time, but we know there are a whole lot more of you. If we want to hear from everybody, if you could just take a moment, quick moment to take that survey. And with that, I'll quickly turn it over to Mike, who's going to close for the night.
So just again, recapping the presentations we heard today. So we learned about the history of climate policies in Washington from Lauren, which include a carbon fee, ballot initiative, 100% clean energy policy, an energy efficiency standards, and a task force to address environmental health disparities. We also heard from Eric today about fossil fuels, what they are and what they're used for. And why Washington's energy economy isn't important when considering the state of fossil fuels and the opportunities in thinking about fossil fuel transport and infrastructure and ways to reduce carbon emissions. We learned from David about environmental justice, what that means, its definition, and what's happened in Washington state over the past several years, and why it's important in considering that when creating policies. We learned from Tim about the Growth Management Act, which kind of brings together multiple presentations about transportation, ecosystems, buildings, what it is, and how that affects our emissions and opportunities to reduce emissions, especially in transportation and buildings. And finally, we learned from Dr. Astana about contextualizing Washington climate and the action that we're doing in this state and how it compares to the international context, both in terms of our goals, our progress, and our actions, and ended with some opportunities to think about moving forward in the future. So finally, we have learning session number 7, which is bringing it all together. It's our final learning session. And we have a lot of presenters coming in, presenting on a variety of different topics. So as a one point of process, we're going to be doing a conference style presentation in this last style, where there will be different sessions and different tracks focused on different topics. And so over the next few days, you'll get a survey from Wendy where you can choose which topics you want to attend. So with that, thank you again. Please fill out the survey that's in the chat. It was great to see everyone again tonight. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your evening.
Thank you so much.